Today we're going to talk about Augustine. Saint Augustine was the bishop of Hippo in North Africa, modern-day Algeria. And his story is an extraordinary story. When you begin to look at his context and his nature as a cosmopolitan figure, his education and his writings, he is a huge figure, not only in the life of the church, but Western civilization as well. So studying Augustine is never a waste of time. In fact, studying Augustine, you can get a glimpse into how philosophy and theology, how they emerge after the 5th century to the 6th and 7th century, leading up to people like Francis and Aquinas along the way. So who was St. Augustine? How did he get where he was, and what was his background? His most notable features, he is the bishop, as I said. He's made bishop even though he really didn't want to be, but that's a little later in his story. He takes up a defense in the book The City of God. He takes up a defense against the allegation that Christians were to blame for the fall of the Roman Empire. You remember the Roman Empire lays in ruins, and Augustine is one who's been educated in Rome. He lives in what's modern-day Algeria, and he is trying to identify where he fits into a vastly changing world, and that's most certainly also having to do with his own personal life. He was a person that was all in between on a bunch of different things, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit later. He's known for The City of God, the Confessions, on the Trinity, his commentaries, his works on prayer. I think the most widely known of his books is the Confessions. And then The City of God would have to be the second most well-known book. The Confessions makes for excellent reading even today. It begins that kind of a genre called the memoir, a spiritual autobiography by a person who was really a genius, rich in thought. So the Confessions, that's our major source for Augustine's development and his kind of journey. He grew up in uncertain times, in Carthage. He was a huge Cicero fan. Cicero, you may recall, is the Stoic philosopher in Rome, in the late Roman Republic in the 60s BC and all the way to the 40s BC. And Cicero wrote a ton of rhetoric. He was a lawyer, he was a philosopher, and Augustine he devoured everything he could read. Augustine's dad was a lawyer, and so Augustine fancied with that too. He was going to practice law. And he decides to go and study law. He practices law, but he also loves philosophy, and so he also does that. Augustine is known for describing the problem of sin as pride. And that needs to be unpacked a little bit. My own opinion is that the rest of Scripture is a comment and the search for a solution to Genesis 3, the fall, not the season of the year, but the fall from grace. And Genesis 3 describes Adam and Eve in the garden and an idyllic source of paradise where food naturally grows, where animals, including all of the beasts, are vegetarian. If you look at Genesis 1 at the very end of the chapter. And then what happens? The temptation scene in Genesis 3, where the serpent wanders in and asks the woman to take from the fruit of the tree. And God has told the man and the woman not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in Genesis 3, they do. And the archetypal story describes the assertiveness of our own self-interest. But Augustine boils this problem down to pride. Whether it's the influence of Paul's Romans or Galatians, that really is the root of Augustine's idea. There is, of course, within Genesis 3, that notion that Adam and Eve are making decisions about their existence that only God is qualified to make. And so that, of course, is a dramatic act of hubris. Augustine sees that, and he puts that as the basic root of sin, is the idea that I can do for myself, of myself, and that ultimately I can even be the architect of my own salvation. This, Augustine says, is the root of all sin. If we were to define sin, sin, of course, has a lot. You can define it in many different ways. But it's the breaking of a known law. And then the resulting aspect of that sin, breaking a known law, a law that presumably God has put into place, that, of course, is an item up for discussion. But just to keep things more simple, then the trajectory of that sin, that brokenness, remains an offended God, or a God to whom that person is in debt. There's always a moral claim when God encounters humanity. You can see that from page 1 all the way to the end of the scriptural witness. To evacuate it of its moral content is to simply not see. So for Augustine, it's that pride that I can elevate myself, that I can do for myself, that, it can be me plus God or God plus me, rather than only God and God's grace. Pride, Augustine says, is the root of all sin. Well, that, of course, is a later development after he discovers what sin is. Before that, he had been a member of the Mani cult, this sect that practiced hyper enthusiasm and almost like a whirling dervish kind of a sect. He fell in with this group somewhat in its Gnostic tendencies, like the depreciation of material possessions and those kinds of things. They kind of set a mark on it. Now, Mani was an interesting character. His eclectic faith was extremely popular between the 3rd and the 7th centuries. Mani wanted to suggest that Christianity, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism were all incomplete of their own, even Judaism, were incomplete and required further material. And so he believed he had received this special revelation at the age of 12 and then again at the age of 24. The cosmology that's implied with Manichaeanism, that's the version of the faith, is broadly construed as dualistic. That is, you've got the good guys on the one side, the bad guys on the other side, but here is an angel and a devil, a beneficent God on the one hand, and a devil on the other hand. Of course, the pursuit of interests in Manichaeanism, that the idea here is that you will ascend to meet the king of the air, and or the king on high, as it were. It was very popular. Augustine fell in with a group that believed so, and the big teaching that Augustine felt a lot of consonance with is the idea that you could achieve self-realization. So you could see that if he believes that the root of sin is pride, that's a later thing. It may come as a result of his devotion to Manichaeanism. And it's Manichaeism. It's not. There's no other N in there, so you have to forgive that. But so he went to study at Rome, and while at Rome, he becomes part of the philosophical group with Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, these all function in terms of cosmologies that differentiate between the material world and the spiritual world, where the material world is devalued and the spiritual world is elevated. So this sliding scale of being and non-being. Non-being is the material, that which can decay and fall, whereas the real essential pieces of being would exist in the heavens. And so Neoplatonism, you remember Plato, the ideas and the forms and the heavenly ideas that give rise to the different forms, the multiplicity that exists in the material world, are replaced with a unity in the heavenly one. And so the idea here is to ascend through the process of thought, discernment, differentiation, and philosophy, and so elevate your thought so that you can reach the realm of the idea. Now, he's not just known, Augustine is not just known for his theology, but his philosophy is really important too, even as it's embedded in his theological work. So when he talks in the Confessions, he's one of the first people to describe an inner dialogue, something that would be so important in the foundation of existential philosophy. But his philosophical mindset and Neoplatonism is really where he spends most of his time, and that's where his impact is seen. So Augustine, again, the Confessions is our model here. He has a very powerful conversion experience. He has gone to he's gone to Rome to study, and while in Rome, he falls underneath the teaching of Ambrose. Ambrose is a priest in Rome and a bishop in his own right. Now, I don't know much about Ambrose, but when I started to nose around just for a little bit, there were some stories about Ambrose that I thought they had to be apocryphal, that he was not baptized, that he, had all these issues about not becoming a priest, that he did some things that were salacious in order to avoid such a call. I think those are mostly, I would imagine apocryphal, but somebody would be able to correct me. So Ambrose was a powerful orator. And in the church in Milan, Augustine becomes enamored and starts to fall under Ambrose's influence. And as he is practicing his law, and as he becomes a man about town, he begins to inquire about Christianity. And the story goes that one day, out in the middle of the courtyard, as he sat on a stone bench with Paul's letter to the Romans at hand, he heard a little child singing, "Tolle lege, tolle lege." And it says, "Take up and read, take up and read." And so he read, and what he read was Romans chapter 13, which is about the governing authorities, about the strangest conversion passage you could ever identify. But in that moment, Augustine says that he has been converted into a Christian. And so that's a really powerful moment. And if you look up, for instance, at the library at St. John's University, if you look up on above the door, it says "Tolle lege," take up and read. What an appropriate thing to put on the front of the library. So Augustine, we're going to read a little bit from Augustine in the next session. But God is known in the revelation of history. Augustine is one of these people who he believes that God is known within redemption history. And so he also comes up with the idea of time measured in memory. And he talks about the human dilemma. The human dilemma is the misplaced search for good. So when we come back, we're going to look at some of Augustine's writings a little more in depth, so that we can get a feel for this powerful thinker and theologian. Thanks for joining with me. Make a comment. I hope that you get a little more information on Augustine.